Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video is Linux 101 in the sense that if you're someone who's considering using Linux, I want to talk about the different options you have for using Linux. Okay, so the first option is to install Linux in the sense that you either take a computer, you can generally get like a decently refurbished laptop for $200 or $300, and then just wipe whatever operating system it currently has and install Linux instead. Or what you could do is you could do a dual boot where you install Linux alongside your Windows operating system, let's say, if your computer came with that. So the question that begs two questions. One, how do I do that? Which that's going to be pretty straightforward. If you're on Windows, you're going to want to create a boot USB. That means a USB you can boot from. Usually you only need like an 8 gig USB stick. And you're going to look up something called Rufus. Rufus, Windows, Linux. Okay. And what Rufus is literally just something to burn a CD image to a USB drive. Okay, so you'll literally just put in a USB drive into your computer. You'll use this free tool, and this free tool will burn the install disk onto the USB stick. You will then restart your computer and boot into BIOS mode. Now, what that just means is that every processor has a BIOS. It's like an operating system for the processor itself that sets some more fundamental settings. Usually when you first turn on your computer, you'll see like this little thing at the bottom that says like hit F12 or hit escape to go into the BIOS. If you don't see it, Google it for your particular machine. It's not going to be based on your operating system. It's going to be based on the particular computer you have. So just Google like how to get into BIOS for my computer. And then from there, the only thing you really have to do in there is just tell your computer to boot from the USB, which should be pretty straightforward. Different computers, I know like I have an MSI gaming laptop, and I know I had to turn off some security settings to do that, but most computers I've used don't require you to do that. It should just be a matter you boot the USB, and the USB will open on, and the installer for that version of Linux will start. And most of the times that installer will ask you, do you want us to replace your operating system? Do you want us to install it side by side as a dual boot? And then what's going to happen is that when you start your computer, you'll be able to choose which, do you want to boot into Windows? Do you want to boot into Linux? That's one option. Okay. Another option is you could use a virtual machine. Okay, so you would get a piece of software like VirtualBox. Okay, and with VirtualBox, you would take that CD image, that boot image, and then you would be able to like just create a new sort of virtual computer on your existing computer. Now, the only considerations with this is that now, if you're in Windows and you're running VirtualBox, you are sharing all your like RAM, you're sharing your hard drive with this virtual computer all at the same time. So it's not going to run as fast as if Linux was just running by itself. But the benefit is like if you break the virtual machine, you just make another one. Like if you accidentally erase the whole hard drive inside the virtual machine, it's not the end of the world. Nor would it really be in any situation, but sometimes people just feel safer using a virtual machine. But again, it can be slower because depending on how much resources you have to allocate towards it. Okay, usually you'll sit there and you'll hit add. It's gonna see right now it's asking me for an image. I don't have any images, but you can do that. Okay, maybe we'll download an image while we're doing here. And what do I mean by an image? Well, every version of Linux. Well, then there's a lot of versions in Linux, and they're called distros, meaning they're a distribution of Linux. At the end of the day, all versions of Linux are Linux. Like, the Linux operating system doesn't change. What does change is just a lot of the settings, because Linux is just the kernel. The kernel is just like how the computer works, and drivers, and things like that. Everything else is kind of customizable. So basically, like, how do you manage Windows? So you notice, like, on mine, I'm using a version called Pop! OS. I have this sort of like, kind of my sort of preferred sort of visual interface. But there's a lot of different versions of Linux, and then basically is things like the desktop environment, like how does the desktop look like, the Windows manager, how does like your file manager look like, so like when I click here to like manage my files, How does this look like? There's the default package manager. So like, how do you install stuff? All these things are different because there's no sort of like original or sort of like default Linux one. So different distros, while it's still all Linux, they all work the same under the hood. They come with different combinations of things depending on sort of what your preferences are. This is one of my favorite selling points of Linux, that you can kind of find the distro that sort of fits you the best. And then if you become an advanced Linux user, you can use something like Arch, which kind of lets you custom make your preferred version, where you can kind of choose what package managers you want, what desktop environment you want. You just make all these choices at install and create your sort of own custom Linux environment. But if you're watching this, you're probably new, so we're going to keep it simple. So if you're coming from like a Windows environment, probably a good choice is going to be Zorin OS, because it's going to be the one that's going to be sort of most geared towards Windows users. Like, it's built to really build an experience that feels a lot like Windows. Okay, so if we take a look here, see, it looks a lot like Windows. Like, desktop environment's built that way. It has like Wine. It's pre-configured with Wine. Wine is a Windows emulator for Linux, so that way you can install most Windows software. So that way it's going to feel like you're using Windows. So that's what Zorin OS is. Okay, and so again, you would just go download it for any of these. Now, Zorin has different versions. Like, Ultimate has like all the bells and whistles, so depending on your computer. If you have like an older computer, so when I say older computer, that means if you have less than 8 gigs of RAM, then you're going to want to use the light version. Okay, so that way it runs faster. Okay, and that's the beauty of Linux. You can download different versions that are up to date, but can use less resources. They might not look as fancy, but they can turn those old computers, give new life to your older computers that just can't run a new version of Windows or Mac because they're so old. So that's another really awesome use of Linux. So again, for older computers, you can use Lite. For more modern computers, you can use Ultimate or Core of Zorin OS. So you would click on the version you want, then you would click on download, and just go through all the download steps. You would eventually get the ISO, and you can either mount that to a virtual machine, or you can burn that to a USB. And I will, for those who are thinking about Windows Subsystem for Linux, I will get to that. Okay. Now, if you're coming from a Mac environment, then there's Elementary OS that tries to build a environment that looks more like Mac out of the box. So it has like a very sort of classic Mac feel, the desktop environment. So that way you're using Linux, but it feels like you're on a Mac machine. And that's one nice thing about Linux, that if you're on Mac, it's not that much of a shift, because Mac OS and Linux are both at their core based on the Unix operating system. So the way the terminal works in Linux is the same as it works in Mac. There's a lot of things that are similar under the hood, so that kind of makes things a little bit easier. Versus on Windows, Windows is fairly different. It's a completely sort of different operating system. It's not based on Unix. So like in Windows, you use like PowerShell and command prompt, and they're completely different than necessarily using Bash and Zush in Linux and Mac. But again, so Elementary OS provides a more Mac feel, and Zorin provides a more Windows feel as far as your version of Linux. And also a really popular place to start is Ubuntu. Okay, so that's just sort of like everyone's favorite. And I think Elementary and Zorin are both based on versions of Ubuntu, so you have all the benefits of Ubuntu in there, just with the more like Windowsy or Macy type wrapping. But Ubuntu has a bunch of different flavors as well. Let's see here. Ubuntu Desktop is what I care about. Okay. And the thing is that Ubuntu has a bunch of different flavors. Let me just see where I can find here we go, Ubuntu flavors. And generally what they do is each Ubuntu flavor gives you sort of a different like desktop environment. They're just different feels depending on what you prefer. Okay, and the main ones that point out are Xubuntu and Lubuntu. These are the lightweight ones. So again, if you have an older computer, these are going to be your go-tos. They're going to make that older computer feel super fast and nice and smooth. Okay, if you don't have like a more modern spec computer, then I would stick to those. If you have a more modern spec computer, then you can use like the OG Ubuntu, like just normal Ubuntu, or any of these other flavors of Ubuntu, Budgie, Studio, Mate, Kylan. But again, all of these are going to have more custom desktop environments, not like one that looks like Windows, like Zorin, or one that looks like Mac, like Elementary OS. And that's kind of like a light intro. There's like hundreds and hundreds of different distributions and versions of Linux, but if you're new, that should keep you safe. I mean, you know, if you're coming from Windows, probably easiest thing to do is start with Zorin. If you're coming from Mac, probably easiest thing to start is with Elementary and kind of work from there. Now, so far we've introduced two ways you can install it. You could install it with a dual boot, install it on your system, so that way it's a standalone operating system, or you can use a VirtualBox. Another option you have is on Windows, there's something called Windows Subsystem for Linux. And Windows Subsystem for Linux allows you to basically install a Linux operating system on your computer. Now, there's no desktop environment in a sense, so it's not like you have to worry about the different distributions. You're just getting sort of the core. Okay, so basically what you do is you just have it kind of working under the hood. And it gets kind of like its own separate portion of your hard drive, and you can then open up Ubuntu as a terminal, let's say. So there's different versions, so you can install the different versions with Windows Subsystem for Linux, but it allows you to have sort of a Linux environment. Again, it'll still feel like you're Windows on Windows all the time, but you'll be able to open up software from the Linux side, save things to the Linux side, do Linux operations from the Linux side. It can be pretty cool, actually. And again, there's different versions you can install, so you can see here like a lot of the main branches are available on Windows. I think it's pretty cool. If you really just don't want to install like a proper like Linux environment, like it's just a standalone operating system with its own desktop environment, like a real sort of like defined area, this is a pretty good option. It works pretty well. There is like a learning curve because you have to kind of like be able to understand like when you are using Linux versus like when you are in sort of the Windows side, and it's not always super clear. But once you kind of learn how to use WSL, it gives you the best of both worlds. Basically have access to Windows, you have access to Linux, and you can do whatever you need to do on both sides, which is pretty cool. Me personally, once I kind of started working with Linux as my full-time operating system, I just haven't gone back. I started off with like Ubuntu because I wanted to I was using a less powerful computer at the time, and that definitely gave that computer some extra speed. And then afterwards, I got a much nicer computer. I tried out Pop! OS, and I really haven't turned back. I just kind of really like this particular environment. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how to set up Linux. Now, once you actually have Linux, you just explore. Okay, I mean basically really what matters is getting used to terminal. Okay, because you can literally do everything in Linux from here. Like most distros will have, will have a browser. So usually you'll start with a browser, typically like Chromium or something. So I've installed a bunch of stuff. But let's see here, usually start with a browser, and there's usually some sort of like package store. So it's going to be different depending on which distro you have, but there'll be some sort of store where you can kind of like download free software. Although as you get used to Linux, I highly recommend learning how to use a terminal, which is referred to as bash. So you just like Google like how to use bash. And if you get really good with this, you'll feel like Linux is just second nature. It's just easy to use. Things are quicker. And then you can play again with things like Wine. Steam has plenty of games that work on Linux, and now really has like a lot of incorporation of Wine into it. So that way you can play a lot of Windows only games on your Linux. So I would say 90% of the software you use on Windows can probably be installed on Linux using Wine. So you really won't notice a difference. There's really very little that you miss from what you had before. Okay, and on top of it, you get a nice new environment and lots of cool tools, and an access to a whole world of open source, and access also to developer tools, which is pretty cool. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. But yeah, those would be the main things. You pick a distro, learn how to use a terminal after you've installed it, and once you know how to use a terminal, I mean, it's all pretty easy peasy from there. But otherwise, it works pretty much like the way you would expect any desktop operating system to work. You click on things and things happen. Have a great day. Enjoy. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, have a great day, and enjoy.